Hey guys, tonight we're rolling back the clock to a time when rules weren't about parking tickets or Hoa lawn heights, but about how, when, and even what part of the forest you could breathe in. Welcome to the deeply strange, sleep-depriving world of medieval peasant laws, not the cool for the good of society kind. Don't wear purple, don't bake your bread too fluffy, and don't you dare own a dog unless it can fit inside a shoe. So, before you relax into your slightly less flea-infested bed, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this. Drop a comment below telling me what modern rule you'd banish forever. Now, dim the lights, switch on a fan for that white noise, and get as comfortable as possible. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what bizarre rules actually ran a medieval village? Did peasants need a license to get married? Could you get arrested for eating the wrong kind of bread? What happens if you sneeze in church? Did you really need permission to pick up a stick? Is it true that wearing the wrong hat could end in a court summons? How many laws did you accidentally break before breakfast? And just how many ways could the local lord fine you for existing a little too enthusiastically? Well, congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1376. Wearing a tunic that doubles as a napkin and a status symbol, surrounded by a web of rules so dense you could knit a blanket out of them. Get ready, because tonight you're about to become the most law-abiding and possibly the most confused peasant in the whole medieval kingdom. You reach for your one and only tunic, only to remember, velvet? That's a crime. Bright colors? Suspicious. Medieval sumptuary laws dictate exactly what you can wear, based on your status, your income, and sometimes just how much the Lord dislikes you that week. Welcome to a world where fashion police come armed with real, actual pikes. Let's set the scene. It's early morning, your hut is so cold you can see your own breath, and you're staring into a wooden chest containing every piece of clothing you own. You eye that faded green tunic, once the envy of the pig herders, now faded to the color of envy itself, and sigh. You heard that yellow is in fashion this year, but unfortunately, yellow is also reserved for the better sort of folk. Try to brighten up your look, and you might find yourself summoned before the manor court, defending your color palette like you're on a medieval episode of Project Runway, only with more public shaming and a very real threat of a fine. Sumptuary laws were the medieval version of a dress code, but with consequences that ranged from embarrassment to actual jail time. And, because this is medieval Europe, the logic behind these rules is every bit as murky as the village well. For peasants, the law was simple: wear plain wool, stick to brown, grey, or whatever colour best hides stains, and never, ever pretend you can afford silk, satin, or heaven forbid, velvet. Velvet was so off-limits, it may as well have been radioactive. Just touching it could land you in trouble, unless, of course, you were a baron's favourite hunting dog who sometimes wore fancier collars than most actual peasants. The real purpose behind sumptuary laws was to keep everyone in their place. Nobles needed to look noble. Merchants could look moderately successful, but never rich enough to threaten their betters. Peasants? You were meant to look, well, like a peasant. If you got above your station, even by accident, you'd quickly be reminded. Heaven help you if you tried to sneak in a little colour or some extra embroidery. That's how you end up being a cautionary tale for the entire village, pointed at by children who have never seen a green hat before. Wool was your only real option. But not nice, soft, cuddly wool. No, you get the scratchy, questionably brown stuff that collects every bit of hay, animal dander, and mystery substance it can. And while you might be tempted to jazz up your look with a splash of red or blue, the medieval equivalent of flexing on Instagram, those dyes were heavily restricted. Only those with the right rank, the right permissions, and the right amount of money slipping quietly to the local reeve could even hope to wear something that looked vaguely cheerful. Accidentally look too prosperous, and you might get the honor of being used as an example during the next village assembly. The rules didn't stop at color. Some laws went so far as to specify how many buttons you could have, whether you could wear a belt, or what kind of shoes you were allowed to own. Too many buttons? Clearly trying to pass yourself off as a noble. Shoes with pointed toes? That's for the knight's squire, not you. Even hats weren't safe. Some regions had entire pages of rules about who could wear what kind of hat and when. Imagine being fined because your hat was too floppy on a Wednesday. Of course, enforcement was spotty at best. Some years, no one cared if you looked like you mugged a minor noble. Other years, the local Lord Steward would go on a power trip, inspecting sleeves and measuring cloak lengths like it was his only purpose in life. If you got caught, punishment ranged from fines, always more than you could afford, to being forced to wear your offending clothing inside out, or, my personal favourite, having your illegal hat nailed to the stocks as a warning to others. Talk about a statement piece. And if you were thinking about rebelling, good luck. The only real loophole was getting so dirty that no one could tell if your tunic started life as navy blue or just ended up that way after a long winter. Dirt. The great medieval equalizer. So next time you complain about dress codes at work or get annoyed because your favorite jeans aren't business casual, just remember, at least no one's inspecting your wardrobe with a pike. In the Middle Ages, fashion wasn't just a choice, it was a trap. And unless you wanted to make history as the peasant who wore the wrong colour on St. Swithin's Day, it was best to keep your style as invisible as possible. Congratulations, you survived another morning of not being arrested by the wool police. Now, if only you could find matching socks. It's market day, and you spot a beautiful, fluffy loaf. Careful. Laws say peasants can only eat black bread, none of that decadent white stuff, which is reserved for your betters. Try to sneak a bite, and you could be fined, shamed, or just laughed at for your doughy ambitions. Let's pause for a second and appreciate the sheer medieval pettiness of bread laws. You wake up hungry, thinking maybe, just maybe, today's the day you treat yourself. You wander to the market, your mouth watering at the smell of fresh loaves, only to remember, nope, the good stuff isn't for you. That pale, soft, cloud-like bread, it's a medieval status symbol. You, on the other hand, are stuck with something closer to a doorstop, dense, dark, and chewy enough to break a molar. Welcome to the medieval peasant's daily bread dilemma. The rules are simple. Dark bread, sometimes called rye bread, or maslin, for everyone below the merchant class. White bread is for clergy, nobles, and anyone with enough money or connections to have a loaf blessed by the local baker and possibly the parish priest. If you show up to a village feast with a slice of white bread, you might as well wear a neon sign reading, "Please audit my entire life." Why was bread so important? Because, believe it or not, bread wasn't just food. It was social ranking in edible form. The whiter the bread, the higher your status. Bread made with sifted wheat flour was expensive, time-consuming, and involved more labor than your average cathedral restoration. If you were a peasant, your daily bread was usually a murky blend of rye, barley, oats, and, if it was a bad year, a generous helping of sawdust or ground-up beans. It was heavy, sour, and as far from fluffy as a medieval bedbug is from a puppy. The bread police, yes, those existed, took their job seriously. Bakers were regulated down to the ounce, and markets had official bread inspectors who would check loaves for size, weight, and, crucially, colour. Caught selling higher-class bread to a peasant? That was a fine for the baker and a public scolding for you. Try to buy it in secret, and you risked being ratted out by jealous neighbours who'd love nothing more than to watch you get a medieval dressing down for your taste in carbs. Let's talk about why this rule was so strictly enforced. The short answer? It was all about keeping people in their place. If you could afford white bread, you might start thinking you deserve white bread. And once people start eating like nobles, they might start acting like nobles. demanding better wages, less back-breaking work. Or, heaven forbid, a say in how many hours you have to spend chasing your neighbor's escaped pig. Dark bread kept everyone humble, regular, and in their social lane. And it wasn't just about color or fluffiness. There were even rules about how bread was baked. Certain ovens were reserved for the Lord's household, or for baking the fancy loaves. Try to use those ovens for your brown lump of sadness, and you'd get a quick reminder of where you stood, likely involving a fee, an apology, and a new nickname: oven trespasser. If you're wondering whether anyone rebelled, the answer is yes and no. Sure, there were a few bold souls who tried to pass off white bread as just a little overbaked, but they usually got caught. Rumors spread quickly in small villages. If you were seen with a suspiciously pale crumb, you'd get side eyes at the alehouse for weeks. Some people even hid their white bread in the middle of a sandwich of black bread slices, like a medieval Big Mac, just to get a taste of the forbidden fluff. Of course, most peasants made the best of what they had. Black bread was filling, lasted longer, and doubled as a decent projectile in sibling disputes. Some families added onions, herbs, or even a touch of honey if you had an inside track with a friendly beekeeper to make it edible. And every now and then, at a festival or on a saint's day, someone in the Lord's household would hand out a scrap of white bread as a treat for the loyal workers. The taste? Pure luxury. Worth the wait. Worth the risk. So, next time you bite into a slice of fresh sourdough or buy a baguette just because it's Tuesday, remember, you're living the dream your ancestors could only imagine. Bread may seem simple, but in the medieval world, it was a daily reminder that you were always just one bite away from breaking the law. Bon appetit, law-abiding citizen. Just don't let anyone catch you with ciabatta before you've cleared it with your local reeve. You need firewood, but the forest is off limits. Royal forests are protected, and taking a single stick without permission is technically theft. There are entire squads of angry, underpaid foresters watching the trees so you don't get ideas. Good luck staying warm. Welcome to medieval land management, where the woods aren't just trees, they're a tangle of rules, fines, and angry men with axes who don't work for you. The royal forest isn't just any forest. It's a legal entity, stretching for miles, reserved for kings, nobles, and their privileged hunting parties. For the average peasant, forests are the place where dreams of a warm winter go to die. Let's start with the basics. You wake up, and it's freezing. The fire in your hovel is nothing but faint embers and wishful thinking. You stare out at the tree line, close enough to taunt you, yet more protected than the local abbey's wine cellar. The law says you're not allowed to take wood. Not even dead branches. That's the king's wood. You are, however, permitted to freeze quietly. It's not just about firewood. Everything in the forest is basically contraband for peasants. Fallen timber? Illegal? Twigs for kindling? Also illegal. Mushrooms, berries, or even the odd squirrel. Off limits without a foraging license. Yes, a real thing. Meanwhile, you watch the local lord's retinue strut through the woods, crossbows in hand, hunting deer you'll never see on your own dinner table, unless one gets run over by a cart, and even then you're supposed to hand it over. And who keeps you honest? The foresters, of course. Think of them as the woodland hall monitors, except with more facial hair and considerably worse tempers. Foresters are sworn to protect the king's peace in the forest, which means they spend their days lurking behind trees, popping out to accuse peasants of looking at firewood with intent to commit warmth. Their loyalty is to the Lord, not to your frostbitten toes. Some take their job very seriously, maybe a little too seriously, given that the only excitement in their life is catching a shepherd's kid with a bundle of sticks. The punishments? Far from cozy. Get caught collecting firewood, and you could face fines, public shaming, or a few hours in the stocks, which is not the winter getaway you're hoping for. Repeat offenses meant steeper penalties. sometimes even forced labor, or, in rare cases, losing an ear, because nothing says don't do it again like permanently altering your hat situation. The forest laws were so complicated that some villages had official forest interpreters just to explain which twigs you could touch and which would get you sent to forest jail. But peasants are resourceful, and where there's a will to avoid hypothermia, there's a way. Many folks became experts in stealth, gathering wood in the early hours, covering tracks, and always keeping an eye out for those telltale green cloaks. Kids were sent to collect windfall sticks, the legal grey area, though everyone understood that a windfall was a relative term. If a stick just happened to fall off a tree while you were shaking it, well, who's to say? Some even formed informal wood gangs, sharing the risk and splitting the haul, like a very cold, extremely polite version of Ocean's 11. Of course, not everyone got away with it. There were always tales of unlucky souls who got caught dragging a suspiciously large branch back home and were forced to explain themselves before the manor court. The usual defense? I was just admiring its shape. Points for creativity, but rarely successful. Foraging was another matter entirely. Technically, you could gather certain things like nuts, wild herbs, or brambles if you had the right permissions or paid the annual pannage fee. But most peasants could barely afford food, let alone a mushroom-picking license. Meanwhile, pigs belonging to the lord were allowed to roam and root up truffles at will. That's right, even the pigs had more forest access than you. What did this all mean for daily life? Winters were spent conserving every last scrap of legal firewood, rationing heat like gold. Huts were smoky and damp, full of creative heating methods. Think dried cow dung, straw bundles, or just huddling with livestock and hoping for the best. If you did manage to sneak out and score some illegal wood, you became the family hero. At least until your neighbor ratted you out to the forester for a favor. So next time you light your fireplace or crank up the central heating, spare a thought for your medieval ancestors, shivering, plotting, and learning the true meaning of forbidden fruit, the humble stick. In the battle between warmth and the royal law, the house always won, and it definitely wasn't yours. Fish sounds like a nice change from turnips, right? Think again. Medieval ponds and streams are the property of the local lord, and poaching is a risky business. One false cast and it's off to court, or at least a stern talking to from someone with an overdeveloped sense of justice. Imagine this. It's early summer, and you've survived yet another winter of root vegetables and bread so dense it could be used as a blunt weapon. Your body is craving something, anything, that doesn't taste like it was dug up in a hurry. You glance over at the village pond, shimmering in the sun and practically advertising itself. Hey there, hungry peasant, come try your luck. But before you even dip your big toe into that water, know this. The fish inside belong to someone else, and that someone has both a title and a well-developed fondness for strict enforcement. In the medieval world, water wasn't just water. Every pond, stream, and even suspiciously damp ditch was owned by someone, usually the lord whose coat of arms was more important than the 10 Commandments. The right to fish wasn't about need, it was about privilege. If you were caught with a line, a net, or even an over-enthusiastic look in the direction of a carp, you were in violation of one of the era's most jealously guarded rules. You could be accused of poaching, a crime that in some places ranked just below heresy and just above asking for a raise. Let's talk about the pond police. That's right, entire squads of bailiffs, reeves, and self-appointed fish wardens roamed the banks, eager to catch peasants with a contraband trout. These were not the sort of people to let things slide either. If you looked suspiciously wet, you might find yourself cornered and asked to explain what you've been doing with that suspiciously damp tunic. Just slipped and fell, honest, you'd say. But everyone knows the just fell in defense is as old as the pond itself. The punishments for poaching ranged from fines you could never pay to having your fishing equipment confiscated. Not tragic until you realize your net was also your only blanket, to a spell in the stocks for everyone to see. Sometimes you'd be dragged in front of the manor court, where the local lord or his steward would glare at you over a desk covered in quills, wax, and petty grievances. Did you or did you not attempt to disturb the peace of my royal carp? The only thing more embarrassing than being found guilty was being found guilty and still going home hungry. But as always, peasants found loopholes, some clever, some desperate, all born out of necessity. For one, it was technically legal to rescue fish stranded in puddles after a flood, as long as you could convincingly argue that you were saving its life, not seasoning it for dinner. Then there were the night raids, where entire families would sneak down to the water's edge with baskets and old sacks, whispering like medieval ninjas, hoping the moon was clouded over and the bailiff was drunk. If you got caught, the entire village heard about it by morning, and you'd spend the next week trying to trade turnips for someone else's silence. Sometimes the rules got downright absurd. There were actually ordinances specifying what size fish you could take. Spoiler, none of them were large enough to actually feed a family. Or banning certain nets that were too efficient at catching fish, which is exactly the point if you're a hungry peasant and not a fish enthusiast. Some lords even had their own fish breeding programs, fattening up their precious stocks for exclusive banquets. Meanwhile, you're standing knee-deep in mud, dreaming of a single fried perch. Every now and then, someone got lucky. Maybe the steward was in a good mood, or maybe there was a bumper crop of fish, and a few accidentally found their way into peasant stew pots. If you managed to score a fish and not get caught, it was a day of pure luxury. A meal to remember. A brief taste of what the other side of the feudal system must feel like. Warm, full, and not being yelled at for standing too close to the water. So, next time you order salmon at a restaurant or toss a line into a public lake just for fun, remember your medieval counterparts who risked it all for a single bite. In a world where fish belonged to the few and turnips to the many, poaching wasn't just about breaking the law. It was about survival, hope, and just a little bit of mischief. Catch of the day? Only if you were lucky and fast. Love is great, but not so fast. Before you tie the knot, you need your lord's permission. Yes, you need a license to get married. Fall in love spontaneously? That's adorable and possibly illegal. Let's be honest. In medieval Europe, romance was not just about fluttering hearts and poetic walks through the barley fields. It was about paperwork, fees, and a healthy dose of feudal micromanagement. Before you could start your forever with your beloved, you had to clear it with the local authority. Usually a man who owned more sheep than books and had a vested interest in your reproductive decisions. There was no eloping to Vegas. There was barely eloping to the next village. Your path to wedded bliss was lined with red tape, grumpy clerks, and at least one suspicious reeve. Why all the fuss? Simple. Marriage meant alliances, property, and most importantly, taxes. The Lord didn't care if you found your soulmate or if you just wanted someone to help with the relentless haymaking. What mattered was that every new household meant changes to the workforce, inheritance, and who owed what to whom. Before you could take your vows, you needed official permission, often in the form of a marriage license. Not the romantic kind, no parchment covered in gold leaf or doves, just a dry document signed by someone with chronic halitosis. The process started with an application, which is a fancy word for begging permission, usually involving your parents, your future in-laws, and the local priest. Everyone gathered to agree that, yes, these two people were suitable, and no, you weren't related, at least not that closely. Then, it was time for the Lord's say-so. Sometimes this involved a formal petition, sometimes just a bribe, and always a sense of dread that the answer might be no for reasons that would never be explained to you. If you skipped this process, well, that was a problem. Secret marriages did happen, but they were risky. Without the Lord's approval, your union could be declared invalid. That meant any kids you had might not inherit property, not that you had much. and you could be fined or punished for your act of wild, reckless, unapproved love. In some cases, the local church might even force you to pay a fine called merchant, essentially a fee for depriving the Lord of his theoretical right to approve your marriage. Yes, that's right. You needed to buy permission to start a family, as if love itself was a taxable commodity. And the rules didn't just apply to the peasants. Widows, widowers, and even tenants who wanted to remarry had to check in with the powers that be. Sometimes, widows paid extra for the right to remain unmarried, because nothing says rest in peace like a bill for declining a second go-around with medieval matrimony. The logic was always the same. The Lord needed to keep tabs on who lived where, who worked what fields, and who might one day produce more little workers, also known as children. The process itself was anything but romantic. Imagine nervously standing before a stone-faced steward, hands clasped, explaining that yes, you really do want to marry Edith from the next village. And no, you aren't just after her family's collection of moderately sized turnips. If the Lord liked you, or just needed another hand for hay season, you'd probably get the nod. If not, you might find yourself single for another season, or paired with someone entirely unexpected, like Bertha, who was famous for her ability to outplow an ox and terrify small children. Still, despite the bureaucracy, love managed to survive. Couples whispered promises by moonlight, traded tokens, and occasionally plotted elaborate schemes to get their paperwork in order. Some even managed clandestine weddings, with sympathetic priests and friends sworn to secrecy. But for most, getting married was just another medieval endurance test. Keep your head down, say the right things, pay your dues, and hope the Lord didn't wake up grumpy on license day. So next time you fill out a wedding registry, complain about invitation lists, or grumble about marriage licenses, remember, at least nobody is checking your family tree with a magnifying glass or making you pay a love tax. In medieval times, romance wasn't just risky, it was regulated. And if you survived the paperwork, the fees, and the sideways glances from the Lord's steward, congratulations, you earned your happy ending the hard way. Sharing your one-room hut with a goat? Not for long. Local regulations often banned animals from sleeping indoors, unless it was winter, in which case rules magically evaporate. But catch a nosy neighbor at the wrong time, and you'll find yourself in livestock court. Let's set the scene. It's midnight, a wind is howling, and you're curled up on a straw mattress so thin it might technically qualify as garnish. Your breath clouds in the icy air. Next to you is the family pig, snoring contentedly. Across the room, your prize goat is chewing cud, and a few chickens are huddled under the table for warmth. No, this isn't the start of a children's fable. This is your actual living situation, and, for most of the year, it's technically breaking the rules. Medieval animal laws weren't just about protecting livestock. They were about maintaining order, sanitation, and, above all, the social hierarchy. In theory, animals were supposed to stay outside, in their own makeshift pens or stables. The official line was that letting pigs and cows inside would spread filth and disease, turn houses into stinking cesspools, and generally lower the tone of the entire village. After all, there's nothing more embarrassing than the reeve showing up and finding a cow warming her hooves by the fire, unless it's your neighbor's sheep borrowing your pillow. But here's the problem. Medieval winters were brutal, and a thatched roof is not central heating. If you wanted your animals alive by spring, the only way was to invite them in. Pigs, in particular, were notorious for dropping dead if left outside during a cold snap. Bad news if you were hoping for bacon in March. Goats, sheep, even chickens would sometimes visit the family room, especially when a deep freeze hit or when a litter of piglets arrived during a blizzard. You did what you had to do to survive. The authorities, of course, had other ideas. Local lords, bailiffs, or even the parish priest could fine or shame families caught with animals indoors. At least when the weather wasn't officially harsh. The punishments were sometimes comical, sometimes cruel. Anything from being ordered to clean the streets as penance, to having your best pig confiscated, to being paraded around the village square as the squire of swine. That's right. Public humiliation over your interior decorating choices. Enter the livestock court. A real thing. With a real judge. Often the local lord's steward or a reeve, with a taste for drama. You'd be called up to explain why, exactly, Daisy the cow was found snoozing next to your fireplace. You could try the usual defenses. She wandered in, or she was just visiting, or, if all else failed, the chicken needed emotional support. Sometimes these excuses worked, especially if you brought a nice cheese for the judge. Other times, you'd just get another fine. Because nothing says justice like emptying your purse to atone for cozy piglets. And of course, there were exceptions. Lots of them. If it was the middle of a harsh winter, authorities often looked the other way. After all, everyone knew that dead animals meant lost income. And, frankly, a stinking hut in spring was better than starving children in February. In some places, the laws changed week to week, depending on whether the lord had stepped in something unpleasant on his last inspection. But don't forget your neighbours, the original medieval surveillance state. If old Agnes saw you sneaking your goat in at dusk, you could expect a knock at the door and a scolding, if not a full-blown livestock investigation. Nothing motivated village gossip like the rumour of a piglet on a pillow. On the flip side, that same neighbour would be the first to ask for help, sneaking her chickens in come December. Hypocrisy, the oldest tradition of all. Despite the rules, families made it work. Animals provided heat, companionship, and, in the goat's case, early morning alarms with no snooze button. You swept the floor daily, aired out the hut when possible, and pretended not to notice when the pigs stole your spot near the fire. Life was cold, chaotic, and sometimes smelly, but at least everyone, human and animal alike, got through the winter together. So next time your dog sneaks up on the couch, remember, you're honoring a long tradition of breaking house rules for the sake of survival. And if anyone ever accuses you of living like a pig, you can tell them it's historically accurate. It's evening. Time to not leave your house. Medieval towns imposed strict curfews for peasants, enforced by bell ringers and occasionally angry mobs. Get caught out after dark, and you could face a fine or the medieval version of community service, cleaning up after the town's only ox. Let's paint the scene. You're sitting by the hearth, gnawing on bread that could double as a weapon when the church bell rings out over the rooftops. That's not a call to prayer, it's a warning. The curfew bell. In medieval towns, this was the sound of doors bolting shut, shutters clattering, and the entire village collectively agreeing to pretend nothing suspicious ever happened after sunset. Night was for sleeping, not socializing, unless you enjoyed mandatory volunteer work and public humiliation. The idea behind curfews was simple: keep order, prevent crime, and, most importantly, keep the peasants where they belong. After all, everyone knows that crime, chaos, and unapproved dancing thrive in the darkness. For the lords and town officials, curfew was like a medieval snooze button. Hit it, and all the troublemakers disappear, at least until sunrise. For you, the humble villager, it meant making sure every errand, gossip session, and emergency pig rescue wrapped up before the final clang. Enforcement was, let's say, enthusiastic. Some towns had a curfew officer, a man whose entire job was to make sure nobody was out after dark unless you had a really good excuse, like I'm giving birth or I'm literally on fire. Otherwise, being seen after hours was an invitation to trouble. You might be stopped, questioned, and paraded back to your door in front of your snickering neighbors. Worse still, you could be sentenced to medieval community service. And no, that's not planting trees or picking up trash. That's cleaning the village latrines, repairing fences, or, if you were truly unlucky, shoveling after the town ox. Nothing says I broke curfew quite like smelling of livestock for a week. The curfew itself varied from place to place. Sometimes it was sunset, sometimes a set hour after. In winter, the nights were long, and the window for honest activity was short. Forget meeting friends for a late-night pint or sneaking out for a stargazing walk. If you wanted to catch up on village gossip, you'd better do it by the light of day, preferably with witnesses. And if you're thinking, you could just slip out quietly. Remember, medieval towns were full of night watchmen, bored dogs, and neighbors whose hobbies included spot the rule breaker. Of course, there were exceptions, because what's a rule without a dozen loopholes? Merchants sometimes got special passes to move goods at night, and the local priest could be out late if summoned by God. Conveniently, God was sometimes very chatty around the time the tavern closed. But for ordinary folk, any after-dark adventure needed a permission slip or a really convincing lie. Some people risked it for emergencies, others for love, and the truly bold for bread. But most people just stayed put, counting the hours until morning. Why all the fuss? Medieval towns weren't exactly safe after dark. No streetlights, no police, just inky blackness and the possibility of running into bandits, wild animals, or that one neighbor who talked too much about omens. Fires were a real danger, too. Open flames in rickety wooden houses meant one careless ember could turn the whole place into a cautionary tale. Keeping everyone indoors reduced the risk, at least in theory. But for many, the worst part of curfew wasn't the rules. It was the boredom. Once the bell rang, your options were limited. Listen to Grandpa's stories, mend a sock, stare into the fire, or play guess what that smell is. The curfew was a nightly reminder that life wasn't just hard, it was strictly scheduled. Still, people found ways to make it work. Families used the forced downtime to tell stories, share news, or plot minor acts of rebellion, like sneaking out to check on a sick animal. Sometimes, neighbors whispered through thin walls, or sent kids to deliver secret messages under the cover of taking out the slop bucket. Because even in a world of rules, routine, and relentless oversight, the desire for just a little freedom always found a crack. So next time you're annoyed by a 10 p.m. noise ordinance or a neighbor with opinions about your porch light, remember, at least nobody's ringing a bell to announce bedtime for the whole street. In the Middle Ages, the sun going down didn't just end the day, it ended your freedom. And if you dared to break the rule, you'd better be ready to scrub the ox, no questions asked. Hope you're feeling pious. Because missing Mass isn't just a sin, it's a legal violation. The parish priest knows exactly who's absent, and fines or even public shaming are routine for skipping Sunday service. Let's set the mood. It's Sunday morning, the sun is barely up, and your joints ache from a week of fieldwork. Maybe you'd like to sleep in, have a slow breakfast, or just stay home and negotiate peace between your family and the chickens. But in the medieval village, there's no such thing as a lazy Sunday. The church bell is ringing, loud, long, and relentless, reminding you and every other peasant that today's to-do list starts with penance. If you don't show up, it's not just your soul at risk, it's your wallet, your reputation, and, on a really bad week, your seating privileges at the next village feast. This wasn't an empty threat. In medieval Europe, church and state were practically the same thing. The parish priest had more power than the mayor, the village elder, and your nosiest neighbor combined. His weekly attendance sheet was legendary, and missing Mass was a surefire way to end up on it. Some churches even employed Mass wardens, real people with the deeply fulfilling job of taking attendance, hunting down absentees, and, just for fun, reporting them to the authorities. The punishment for skipping church wasn't just spiritual. Sure, the priest would pray extra hard for your sinful soul, but there was usually a much faster route to repentance: fines. And these weren't symbolic little pennies. Sometimes you'd owe more than a week's wages for a single absence. If you were lucky, you'd get off with a public shaming, your name read aloud at the next service, or worse, having to stand in the back wearing a special hat or holding a sign that said slacker. No medieval word for slacker, but the sentiment was there. For repeat offenders, things could get even more creative. Some towns made you perform public penance, like sweeping the church steps or cleaning out the candle stubs after Mass. Others required you to stand in the village square and listen to a very long, very loud sermon on the evils of laziness, all while your neighbors judged you in between discreet naps. If you managed to annoy the priest personally, say, by questioning his Latin or suggesting the choir was off-key, there was always the risk of extra prayers for you and extra chores also for you. But maybe, just maybe, you were genuinely ill or had a legitimate emergency. No problem. All you had to do was send a note with a trustworthy neighbor, who would then relay your excuse to the priest. Of course, your neighbor would also relay this news to everyone else in the village, because why waste a good story? Did you hear? Edith missed Mass because her goat got stuck on the roof again. Now everyone knows about your goat, your absence, and your apparent priorities, and don't think for a second you could just blend in at the back. Medieval churches were small, and pew assignments were a real source of status anxiety. The best seats went to the biggest donors, the noblest families, and the priest's cousins. The rest of you got to stand, kneel, or hover at the back, craning your neck for a glimpse of the altar, while the priest delivered another stirring message about tithes, obedience, and the importance of not letting your mind wander or your body wander out the door. Children, of course, weren't off the hook. Parents were responsible for herding the entire brood into church, no matter how wriggly or sticky. Even babies had to attend, mostly so the priest could remind you how important it was to start fearing God early. As for teenagers, let's just say that if you managed to sneak out during Mass, you were either a genius or had a future as a professional escape artist. But even with all the rules, medieval Mass was sometimes the highlight of the week. There was singing, gossip before and after, and the rare excitement of a festival day, when the service ran twice as long and there was a chance for free bread at the end. Sometimes, the only real rest you got all week was during a particularly droning sermon. Just be careful not to snore. So next time you grumble about getting up for work or debate whether to attend that meeting, remember your medieval ancestors. In their world, skipping out on your Sunday obligations wasn't just frowned upon, it was a finable offense. Pray, pay, or prepare to be the star of this week's public penance. Amen to that. Thinking of throwing a party? There are rules about that too. Feast days, the number of guests, the amount of ale you can serve, all regulated. A little too much joy. And you might owe extra taxes. Let's imagine you've survived a brutal winter. The last turnip has finally stopped sprouting roots on your windowsill, and there's a village festival coming up. It's the perfect time to gather your friends, uncork a suspiciously cloudy jug of ale, and pretend for one glorious evening that life isn't just work, mud, and worrying about which law you've broken this week. But not so fast. Medieval authorities had a deep, abiding fear of unsupervised fun. Nothing made a local bailiff sweat like the thought of peasants with enough energy to enjoy themselves. Officially, feasts were allowed on designated holidays, major saints' days, harvest festivals, or the odd royal birthday. But if you tried to throw your own bash, even something innocent like a birthday party for your favorite pig, you'd be treading on very thin ice. Lords and clergy watched for any unlicensed merrymaking, because where there's laughter, there's probably someone plotting to ask for a raise, or, worse, forgetting their place in the world. Every aspect of your shindig was subject to inspection. Local regulations dictated how many people could attend your gathering, how much bread you could offer, how many barrels of ale you were allowed to tap, and what kind of entertainment you could hire. Some villages even required a feasting license, a real stamped document, for a fee, of course. Go over the guest limit? That's a fine. Serve one extra cup of ale? Another fine. Hire a traveling juggler without permission? That's how you end up explaining yourself to a very unamused reeve, while everyone else sneaks away. Why so strict? The logic, if you can call it that, was that excessive feasting led to idleness, unruliness, and potentially even rebellion. Officials were convinced that nothing good ever came from too many peasants eating and drinking in one place. Even medieval chronicles mention times when a party got a little too lively, and suddenly someone's trying to settle an old grudge with a turnip or outdance the bailiff's daughter. If things got truly out of hand, the Lord might issue a ban on feasts, shutting down all gatherings for weeks or even months at a time, just in case happiness was contagious. And it wasn't only the number of guests or the volume of ale that mattered. The menu was closely scrutinized, too. If you served anything too luxurious, say a roast goose instead of the usual boiled cabbage, you risked accusations of pretending to be a noble. Cooks who got too creative were quietly discouraged. The safest way to host a feast was to make it as bland and joyless as possible, so as not to attract the wrong kind of attention or inspire anyone to get ideas above their station. But even under these watchful eyes, people found ways to bend the rules. Families held secret suppers where the curtains were drawn tight and laughter was muffled. Special feast codes developed. A certain whistle meant the bailiff was nearby, and a quick switch to solemn prayers usually fooled anyone snooping. Sometimes, the local priest could be bribed to look the other way, provided he got a plate of the good stuff and a mug of something stronger than weak ale. The taxman also had a field day during feast season. Every extra guest was a potential coin for the Lord's coffers. If you wanted music, you paid a tax. Dancing? That's another fee. If your party was successful enough to be remembered, you could almost guarantee that the next time you celebrated, the fun police would be back, quill in hand and ready to bill you for last year's violations. Still, even with all the hassle, peasants kept celebrating, because sometimes you needed a little joy, legal or not. And in a world where happiness was rationed out like firewood, any excuse to eat, drink, and be merry was worth the risk. So, next time you throw a party and only have to worry about noise complaints from the neighbors, be grateful. In medieval times, the cost of too much fun wasn't just a headache. It could be another tax, a public shaming, or the world's most awkward trip to livestock court. Party responsibly, or at least have a good alibi prepared. Did you know there were fines for letting your pigs roam without a ring in their noses or a tail tied just so? Pig-related laws get weird fast, with local officials measuring tails, ears, and occasionally, your patience. Let's set the scene. You're heading out at dawn to check on your livestock, still half asleep, and there's the local bailiff squinting at your pigs like they've just confessed to arson. He's got a stick in one hand, for pointing, obviously, and a scroll of animal ordinances in the other. Your neighbor whispers, "Watch out, he's on pigtail patrol this week." Welcome to one of the strangest corners of medieval law. Animal appearance regulations, the original blend of animal husbandry and micromanagement. Why all the fuss about tails and nose rings? It turns out medieval towns and manors were obsessed with controlling not just their people, but their animals too. Pigs, in particular, were a walking liability. They rooted through crops, dug up neighbors' gardens, and had a well-deserved reputation for chaos. So, the law came up with a solution. If you were going to let your pigs wander, they had to be properly equipped. This meant a ring in the nose to keep them from rooting, basically the pig version of a do not disturb sign, and, in some places, a tail tied up or even trimmed to a regulation length so the pig couldn't nibble at it. Or maybe just to make the bailiff's job more interesting. The enforcement of these rules was not left to chance. Some towns appointed swine wardens, whose sole purpose in life was to check on local pigs. These self-important officials wandered from farm to farm, tape measure in hand, poking at livestock and sometimes giving lectures on pig hygiene. It's one thing to get a parking ticket, it's quite another to be told your pig's tail is a bit on the jaunty side and needs adjusting. Let's talk about the fines. If your pig was caught without the proper nose ring, you could be fined on the spot. Sometimes the equivalent of a week's earnings. If the tail wasn't tied or was judged to be improperly displayed, that was another fee. If your pig somehow managed to look suspicious, don't laugh, it happened. You might be accused of harboring a dangerous animal and be ordered to build a stronger pen. Multiple offenses could even get your pig confiscated by the town. A punishment that made you both a cautionary tale and the sudden owner of a suspiciously empty dinner table. And it didn't stop with pigs. Sometimes laws extended to sheep with unruly fleece, cows with overgrown horns, and even chickens with inappropriate plumage, whatever that meant. But pigs always seemed to be the real scapegoats, perhaps because they were clever enough to escape, loud enough to cause a commotion, and tasty enough to make the bailiff want a piece of the action. Naturally, peasants got creative. Some tied their pigs' tails into elaborate knots just to confuse the inspectors. Others attached homemade nose rings crafted from whatever metal was handy, bits of broken plough, worn-out belt buckles, or, in a pinch, a child's lost hairpin. There were whispered tricks about making a tail look shorter or longer, depending on who was coming to check. And if you couldn't fix your pig in time for the inspection, you justed it under a blanket, behind the woodpile, occasionally in your neighbor's barn, as long as you returned the favor when needed. The rules themselves changed constantly, depending on which official was bored, which lord was visiting, or whether last year's crop damage had everyone extra cranky. Sometimes the rules were suspended entirely, usually right before a festival, when the authorities didn't want to see a parade of law-breaking swine in front of the nobles. Other times, crackdowns were fierce and sudden, as if someone had decided the only thing standing between civilization and anarchy was a properly adorned pig. So next time you're struggling with a pet's haircut or a neighbor's opinion about your dog's leash, spare a thought for your medieval ancestors, measuring pigtails by lantern light and bribing the swine warden with a jug of ale. In the end, the lesson is clear. In medieval Europe, even your livestock couldn't escape the long, picky arm of the law. And neither could your patience. Brewing beer at home? Better hope it meets the local standards. Ale tasters, yes, a real job. Can shut you down if your brew is too weak, too strong, or, heaven forbid, tastes like pond water. Picture this. You've spent days stirring, boiling, and praying to St. Arnold of Soissons, the patron saint of brewers, naturally, that your homemade ale turns out drinkable this time. You're finally ready to relax and enjoy the fruits of your labor, when suddenly there's a knock at your door. Standing outside is the local ale taster, clipboard in one hand, smug expression in the other, ready to judge your brew like he's Simon Cowell with a hangover. Welcome to the nerve-wracking world of medieval beer regulation, where one man's flavorful is another man's public nuisance. Ale was more than just a drink in the Middle Ages, it was the drink. Water was risky at best, a microbial roulette at worst. Beer was safer, so everyone drank it, from toddlers to toothless elders. That meant quality mattered. Weak ale was an insult. Sour ale was a tragedy. If you tried to cut corners and your brew tasted like something filtered through old socks, you could expect a visit from the health inspector, who, in this case, probably bathed less than your goat. Every town had its official ale taster, sometimes called an ale conner. This was the man tasked with ensuring that local beer wasn't just drinkable, but met strict regulations about taste, strength, and purity. He'd wander the streets, sampling jugs at random, often accompanied by a scribe to write down any misdeeds. and probably to catch him if he got a bit too enthusiastic with his research. Think of him as the original food critic, but with more power, less hygiene, and a deep suspicion of anything experimental. The ale taster's verdict was law. If your beer was too weak, he could have your batch poured out and your name entered into the book of disgrace. Too strong, and you risked accusations of promoting public drunkenness, which, to be honest, was the only thing making the weather bearable. Too cloudy or foul-tasting. The town crier might announce your brewing failure in the market square for everyone to hear. Walter the Tannery's ale tastes like pond scum and last Thursday's boots. Avoid at all costs. Public shaming, always the medieval solution. What about brewing for profit? That required a license and another inspection. Selling ale without permission was a serious offence, and the punishments could be harsh. Fines, confiscation of your brewing equipment, or even a short stay in the stocks for endangering public health. Try explaining to your neighbours that you're in trouble for dangerous beer. It's both embarrassing and a great way to become the village punchline. Of course, every rule breeds resistance. Some homebrewers got clever, hiding their best batches in secret cellars or only serving trusted friends after dark. Others bribed the ale taster with a sample jug, purely for professional purposes, of course. Sometimes the taster himself was an old drinking buddy, willing to overlook a slightly robust flavour in exchange for a cut of the profits. But if you had a rival in the village, maybe old Nan, who swore by her family's secret recipe, expect her to tattle to the authorities at the first hint of competition. And then there were the infamous ale stones, a literal stone used to test the quality and strength of your brew. The taster would pour a little ale onto the stone and sit down in it. If his leather trousers stuck after a few minutes, the beer was deemed sufficiently strong. No stick? Too weak. Yes, medieval science was just as weird as you're imagining. But even with all the inspections, ale remained the lifeblood of the community. Weddings, funerals, harvest festivals, every event needed a few barrels. The best brewers became local legends, their recipes passed down and jealously guarded. And if you happened to make a batch so good the taster begged for more, you'd have friends for life, and a very busy kitchen. So next time you sip a craft brew, spare a thought for your medieval ancestors. For them, every pint was a gamble, and if the ale taster knocked on your door, you'd better hope your beer was strong, pure, and didn't taste like frog. Otherwise, your dreams of becoming the village's answer to Sam Adams would be over before you could say cheers. Ever paid a tax just for having a window? Welcome to the logic of medieval home ownership, where adding a door or window often means a visit from the taxman and another tally on your never-ending list of fees. Let's set the mood. You're in your cramped, dimly lit one-room cottage, tripping over your own goats and thinking, you know what would really improve my quality of life? Maybe a second window, maybe even a door that doesn't double as a wind tunnel. But not so fast. In medieval Europe, light, air, and the basic right to a functional doorway weren't just construction challenges. They were taxable luxuries. If the local lord or the king needed some extra coin, it was time for a new window tax, door duty, or, if you were truly unlucky, both. This was not a rare phenomenon. Medieval governments had a nearly supernatural talent for finding things to tax. They taxed your harvest, your livestock, your marriage, and yes, even the literal holes in your walls. The logic was both brilliant and cruel. More windows and doors meant a bigger, nicer house, which meant you must be rich, or at least richer than your neighbor who still uses a curtain for a front door. Why not pay your fair share? The result? Villages full of houses with the architectural charm of a shoebox. Windows were tiny, just enough to let in a miserable sliver of sunlight, not enough for a cat to squeeze through. Doors were precious. Some homes had just one. Adding a second meant not just a better breeze, but a bill. Want to show off to your neighbors with a lovely new oaken door? Prepare for the tax collector to show up, ready to count the hinges and demand payment per plank. It didn't stop there. In some regions, there were even taxes on chimneys, stairs, and, my personal favorite, luxury thresholds. Because nothing says social mobility like a tax on literally moving from one room to another. The taxman would stroll through the village, notebook in hand, jotting down which families had improved their ventilation situation since his last visit. Ah, I see you've upgraded from horrible gloom to slightly less horrible gloom. That'll be a groat, please. Naturally, peasants got creative. Some built secret windows, hidden behind shutters, or so tiny they doubled as mouse doors. Others bricked up their taxable openings before the collector arrived, then knocked them out again as soon as he left. The truly cunning designed doors that looked like solid walls, unless you pressed the right stone or gave it a little kick. The original secret passageway, invented out of pure financial desperation. Of course, not everyone got away with it. The taxman had his informants, nosy neighbors, jealous relatives, or that one guy who thought windowless living built character. If you were caught with an undeclared opening, the punishment could be severe. Fines, forced labor, or the public shame of having your illegal window bricked up for everyone to see. Nothing ruined the mood like losing your only view of the outside world because you couldn't resist a little extra sunlight. Let's not forget the rich. Nobles, clergy, and wealthy merchants could afford endless windows and doors, sometimes entire galleries of them, just to show off. Their homes blazed with light and air, while you huddled in your glorified root cellar, cursing the day someone invented glass. And if the Lord wanted to impress visitors, he might even lend you a display window for the day, just so the village looked more prosperous than it actually was. Of course, the display window went back into storage as soon as the guests left. Still, there were upsides to living in the shadow of window and door taxes. The lack of airflow made it easier to keep out the cold in winter, and harder to notice the smell in summer. You got really good at navigating in the dark, and privacy was guaranteed, mostly because nobody could actually see into your house. Plus, you developed an uncanny sense of hearing, able to detect a tax collector's footsteps from 3 streets away. So, next time you fling open your double-glazed windows or waltz through your 4th unnecessary doorway, remember the medieval peasants. They lived in a world where every bit of sunlight came with a price tag, and every new door was just another way for the taxman to get his foot in. Home improvement? Only if you were brave, wealthy, or a master of architectural camouflage. Letting your sheep graze on the wrong patch of land is basically a declaration of war. The boundaries of common land are fuzzy, but the rules are rigid. Step over the line, and you'll hear about it for months. Let's imagine. It's a rare sunny morning in the village, and you're herding your family's sheep to pasture, humming a tune and trying not to step in anything best left unstepped in. You reach the edge of the field, the so-called common land, and pause. Is this the right patch? Or are you about to start the medieval version of a turf war? The answer is, nobody really knows. The boundaries are invisible, the stakes are high, and the local busybody has already positioned herself for maximum surveillance. Grazing rights in the Middle Ages were serious business. Every scrap of pasture was accounted for, parceled out in tangled webs of custom, memory, and the occasional angry fistfight. Officially, common land meant everyone could use it with permission, on the right day, at the right time, with the right number of animals, as long as you didn't accidentally look like you were having too much fun. In reality, these rights were jealously guarded. If your sheep wandered 3 feet past an invisible line, you could find yourself at the center of a village scandal. The rules themselves were legendary in their complexity. Some fields could only be grazed after the hay was cut. Others were reserved for the Lord's animals first, then the tenants, and, if there was anything left, for the unimportant livestock, yours. There were stinting rules, which capped how many animals you could put out at once. Exceed the limit, and you'd be accused of overstinting, a crime punishable by fines, scolding, or, worst of all, a lecture from the parish council about the importance of respecting tradition. Enter the grazing wardens, the medieval equivalent of the HOA, but with more sheep and fewer newsletter updates. These officials were tasked with counting animals, checking boundaries, and, most importantly, keeping the peace. If they caught you trespassing, i.e. grazing where you shouldn't, you'd be summoned to explain yourself, usually in front of a council of people who'd already heard about it from their second cousin's wife's neighbour. Penalties ranged from small fines, paid in eggs, ale, or awkward public apologies, to forced labour. Think cleaning ditches, mending fences, or being on manure patrol for a week. Repeat offenders could lose their grazing rights entirely. Nothing struck fear into the heart of a medieval peasant, quite like the threat of banishment from the commons, especially when that meant feeding your animals by hand or, horror of horrors, begging hay from your least favourite relative. Naturally, the system was ripe for feuds. Every village had its epic stories of the Great Sheep Incident of '97 or the cow confrontation by the willow tree. Generations could remember exactly who first crossed the line and whose ram ate whose prized clover. Family grudges were born and nurtured on the commons, sometimes outlasting the people involved. Even church sermons would slyly reference ongoing disputes. And let us not, brothers, stray from the straight path, nor let our flocks trespass. But it wasn't all doom, gloom, and sheep-based drama. Some villages found ways to compromise, rotating pastures, sharing the best spots during lean years, or holding annual meetings where everyone could air grievances and sneak in a few extra sheep when the wardens weren't looking. The occasional grazing holiday turned into an impromptu village picnic, with kids playing tag among the flocks and the elders trading stories about how much easier it was back in their day. Still, the rules always returned, and so did the disputes. Letting your animals wander a little too freely was an invitation to conflict, gossip, and maybe a midnight accidental fence mending by your neighbour. If your sheep developed a taste for forbidden grass, you'd better keep your apology speeches fresh and your bribe eggs ready. So next time you see an empty park or argue with your neighbour about who mows which side of the hedge, spare a thought for the medieval peasant. For them, the grass really was greener on the other side, mostly because someone else was always watching it. And in the battle of property lines and pasture rights, nobody ever truly won except, perhaps, the sheep. Today's market is regulated down to the ounce. The medieval market was, too, but with more shouting. The weight of bread, the volume of beer, and the price of turnips were all controlled by a dizzying array of local laws. Step into the medieval marketplace. If you can squeeze past the goose vendor and avoid the local dog who's perfected the art of stealing sausages, everything feels chaotic. Hawkers yelling over each other, townsfolk clutching baskets, and somewhere the town crier is bellowing the latest price for onions. But beneath the noise and the turnip chucking, this place is governed by rules so precise and so deeply enforced that you can almost hear the collective groan of every baker and brewer for miles around. Let's talk bread first. For the average peasant, bread was life, and since bread riots could topple a mayor faster than the plague, local authorities took no chances. Laws set the price, weight, and even the ingredients of your daily loaf. The assize of bread, for example, was a real medieval ordinance dictating the exact size of a loaf based on the current cost of flour. If the harvest was bad and grain prices rose, the law required smaller loaves for the same price. Not exactly a victory for the hungry, but at least the system was transparent in its own infuriating way. Bakers who tried to cheat the system, using too little flour, too much sawdust, or making their loaves accidentally light, risked the wrath of the bread inspector. Yes, that was a job. This stern individual would weigh your loaf on a market scale, sometimes in front of an entire crowd. Too light, and you could be fined, have your bread publicly confiscated, or be forced to hand out free loaves to the poor. There are even stories of bakers being paraded through the market with subpar bread hung around their necks. A sort of gluten-based walk of shame. Ale wasn't safe from regulation either. Since beer was safer to drink than water, and beloved by just about everyone, Local laws set standards for how much you could sell, what strength it had to be, and even how it should taste. The ale taster or ale conner would wander the stalls, sampling suspicious brews with all the gravitas of a man who's been testing pints since sunrise. If your beer was too weak, you'd be accused of cheating the public. Too strong, and you were endangering the morals of the town, never mind that everyone secretly hoped for the latter. The rules didn't end at food and drink. Market prices for vegetables, fruits, and even livestock were posted by the town bailiff, who would cheerfully fine anyone caught overcharging or cornering the turnip market. Haggling was an art form, but only within the limits set by local law. Try to sell your apples at twice the price after a hailstorm, and you'd find yourself banned from the market, or at least shunned by every angry housewife in town. All these laws were supposedly for the public good. Nobody wanted a famine, a riot, or a night of truly terrible ale, but the rules were a headache for sellers, who lived in constant fear of fines, public scoldings, or the dreaded inspection parade. There were even laws regulating the size of market stalls, the width of your cheese wheels, and, unbelievably, the appropriate amount of froth in a mug of beer. Naturally, people got creative. Bakers would throw in an extra baker's dozen loaf, just in case the inspector came by. Brewers hid their strongest ale for special customers. Stall owners weighed their produce on scales that mysteriously tipped in their favor until the inspector showed up, that is. Still, the rules kept society humming along. If by humming, you mean arguing loudly about cabbage quotas. Next time you're at a farmer's market, sighing at the price of artisanal sourdough, remember. The medieval market was a world of measurement, suspicion, and a lot more yelling about bread. Ever borrowed something and forgotten to return it? In the Middle Ages, that's a criminal offense. The Lord's tools, carts, and sometimes even the actual oxen are off limits without explicit, documented permission. Picture yourself in a muddy field at dawn, struggling to fix a fence that's about as sturdy as a loaf of week-old rye. Your own tools are missing, possibly borrowed by your cousin or eaten by the pig. You spot the manor's shiny, well, slightly less rusty, hammer resting against the barn. Tempting, right? You reach for it. Tell yourself you'll return it in an hour. And, congratulations, you've just committed a crime. Welcome to the wonderful world of feudal property law, where sharing isn't caring, it's larceny. In the medieval world, the lord owned just about everything. The land, the woods, the animals, and, crucially, the best tools in the village. Peasants, on the other hand, had to make do with whatever battered equipment they could afford, often homemade and sometimes held together with hope and bits of twine. So when something really important broke, a wheel, a plough, your dignity, the manor's store of tools was the obvious solution. But the rules were strict. Nothing left the manor yard without paperwork. That could mean a signed chit, a verbal promise witnessed by half the village, or a wax-sealed borrowing order. So official it probably came with its own sermon about honesty. Accidental borrowing wasn't taken lightly. The local reeve or bailiff had a sixth sense for misplaced tools. Lost a shovel? Expect a village-wide search, complete with questioning, neighborly suspicion, and the possibility of someone ratting you out in exchange for a favor. And woe to the soul who borrowed the Lord's oxen without permission. That wasn't just theft, it was an insult to the entire manor. The ox was worth more than most peasants' life savings. And if it went missing, the search party was mobilized like the animal had royal blood. Let's talk about documentation. Medieval villages ran on paperwork, parchment, wax seals, tally sticks, and endless lists. Borrowing anything from the Lord's store required your name in the ledger, a description of the item, and usually a witness to verify you didn't try to walk off with it. If you failed to return the item, no matter how innocent the reason, you faced fines, a public scolding, or, in more severe cases, forced labor. In some villages, repeat offenders had to stand in the stocks with a sign that read, "Thief of the Lord's Hammer," humiliating, but it certainly discouraged forgetfulness. Of course, everyone had their stories. The local legend about Roger the cart borrower, who accidentally took the manor cart and got chased through 3 villages by an irate steward, or the infamous hoe debacle, in which half the fields went unploughed because someone forgot where they left the manor's only decent hoe. These tales were cautionary, often told by parents to their children as a warning. Return what you borrow, or end up like Roger, forever known as a tool thief. And it wasn't just about tools. Seeds, livestock, even scraps of building material were jealously guarded. Borrow a handful of grain, and you risked an audit from the Lord's granary clerk. Borrow a ladder, and forget to return it. And you might find yourself summoned to manor court, explaining your actions to a jury of your extremely unimpressed peers. Still, necessity is the mother of invention and creative storytelling. Peasants became experts at plausible deniability. "I thought it was my hammer" was a classic, as was "The ox followed me home. What was I supposed to do?" And of course, bribing the reeve with a fresh loaf or a mug of ale could sometimes make paperwork disappear. But not always. Lords needed to keep control, and property laws made sure everyone remembered who actually owned what, and that it definitely wasn't you. So, the next time you borrow your neighbor's lawnmower and forget to bring it back, count your blessings. At least you won't end up in the stocks with a wooden sign announcing your new identity as village tool thief. In the Middle Ages, borrowing was a high-stakes game, and you definitely didn't want to lose. Have a tickle in your nose? Pray it waits. There are records of people being fined for sneezing at the wrong time during Mass. Sneeze during the Gospel, and you could find yourself in the stocks, or at least the subject of juicy village gossip. Imagine, you're squeezed onto a rickety bench in a drafty, stone-cold church. Your feet numb, your mind wandering, and suddenly, you feel it, that unmistakable, unstoppable urge to sneeze. You pinch your nose, you try to think of something sad. You even mutter a prayer under your breath. But it's no use. Just as the priest intones the most sacred line of the morning, you unleash a sneeze that echoes off the stained glass. The congregation freezes, heads turn. Somewhere in the back, old Agnes gasps and makes the sign of the cross. Congratulations, you just violated one of the weirdest, most specific church rules of the medieval era. Church in the Middle Ages wasn't just a religious ritual, it was the center of community life. And everything that happened there mattered. Every word, every cough, every sneeze was noticed, catalogued, and, in some places, subject to official rules. Sneezing was an especially dangerous business. The logic was that a sneeze could be seen as a disruption, a sign of inattentiveness, or, depending on the timing, a bad omen. And if there's one thing medieval people loved more than bread, it was a good omen, or avoiding a bad one. Local records actually document fines for people who sneezed at the wrong time during Mass. Some priests took this as a personal affront. A sneeze during the Gospel? Clearly you're not listening closely enough. Or worse, you're casting out a devil without proper supervision. The punishment could be a small coin to the parish fund, a public apology, or, if you were a repeat offender, a stint in the stocks. Not only were you physically uncomfortable, but your sinuses were now village news. The rules could get oddly specific. Sneeze during the opening prayers? That might get a pass. Everyone's still shuffling in and there's enough noise to cover it up. Sneeze during the homily? Maybe a stern look from the priest. But sneeze during the consecration, the holiest of holies, and you might as well have danced down the aisle in your underwear. You'd get stares, whispers, and, if you were unlucky, a visit from the parish beadle, who carried a stick and a deep commitment to law and order. It wasn't just about etiquette. In the superstitious soup of medieval life, sneezes had all sorts of interpretations. Some believed a sneeze let in evil spirits, or that it was the devil's attempt to distract the faithful. Others thought it was a sign that someone in the congregation had unconfessed sins. In some places, the entire congregation would respond in unison, saying, "God bless you," with a level of concern that bordered on panic. A really dramatic sneeze could trigger weeks of speculation. Who was it? Why now? What did it mean for the harvest? Of course, the stories didn't end at church. A poorly timed sneeze became instant gossip fodder. Did you hear about Tom? Sneezed so loud during Mass the priest dropped his chalice. The social penalty was sometimes worse than the fine. You might be teased by children, scolded by your elders, and forever remembered as that sneezy fellow long after the incident. Medieval solutions to sneezing weren't exactly scientific. People stuffed herbs up their noses, pinched themselves, or bit their tongues to stop a sneeze before it started. If you were really desperate, you might skip church altogether. But then you'd face an even bigger penalty for absence. It was a lose-lose situation for your sinuses. Still, even the strictest priest couldn't control nature. Sometimes, the only thing to do was apologize, donate a little extra at the next collection, and hope everyone moved on. And sometimes, if you were lucky, the priest had a good sense of humor and let it slide. But you could be sure that your next sneeze would be met with a room full of wary glances. So next time you stifle a sneeze at a meeting, remember your medieval ancestors. For them, sneezing wasn't just embarrassing, it was a legal hazard, a social blunder, and the start of many an awkward story. Gesundheit, and may your next sneeze come only during the hymn. Animal crime was real. Chickens, pigs, even rats were sometimes put on trial for their misdeeds. If your rooster crowed at the wrong time, you might be forced to defend him in front of a judge and a very bored, very cold audience. Let's imagine it's a damp Tuesday in medieval Europe. You've been summoned, along with your pig, to the village square. The reason? Your pig stands accused of trampling the Lord's vegetable patch or rooting a bit too energetically through the parish priest's onion bed. You'd like to protest, but the bailiff already has a list of witnesses, all human, none sympathetic. And the judge's bench is set up, complete with a tiny seat for the accused. Welcome to medieval animal court, where livestock law and courtroom drama collided. And yes, it was every bit as weird as it sounds. Animal trials weren't just a local quirk, they were surprisingly widespread. Medieval Europeans believed animals, especially domesticated ones, should know how to behave. If a pig broke the rules, it was assumed to be acting willfully, and the owner was sometimes off the hook if the animal could be shown to be the true delinquent. Chickens that laid eggs in the wrong garden, goats that ate the altar cloth, and rats caught stealing grain could all face judgment. Court records survive of pigs being excommunicated, roosters sentenced to death, and dogs put on trial for sorcery. If you think jury duty is dull, imagine sitting through the case of the duck versus the entire village. The process was strangely formal. The animal was given a lawyer, usually the village's most unfortunate clerk or someone being punished for a different crime, and charges were read aloud in Latin. Witnesses would solemnly testify to the misdeeds. I saw the accused pig, known locally as Truffle, enter the Lord's garden at the second hour after sunrise. The defense might argue that the fence was too low, or that the pig was led astray by the influence of wild turnips. Yes, this was all real. Sentences varied with the seriousness of the crime. Some animals were exiled, yes, exiled, from the village, presumably to seek redemption elsewhere. Others were paraded through the streets in shame, wearing symbolic garlands or, in the case of particularly unlucky roosters, tiny wooden yokes. The harshest sentence was execution, sometimes carried out with as much ceremony as a human criminal's. There are records of pigs being hanged or burned at the stake for murder. If you think the Middle Ages weren't theatrical, you haven't seen the crowd that turns out for a pig trial. Naturally, the the practical outcome was usually less dramatic. Most animal defendants were found guilty. The owner paid a fine, and everyone went back to grumbling about the livestock until the next case. But these trials had real social purpose. They were a warning to everyone to control their animals, respect property boundaries, and remember that the village had rules for everything, even for a goose with attitude. For the peasant, an animal trial was mostly a headache. Preparing your defense, "My goat is innocent," took up time, the neighbors whispered, and the kids made up songs about your soon-to-be famous pig. On the upside, if you managed to win the case, you got bragging rights and maybe a little forgiveness for that time your chickens raided the baker's grain sack. Sometimes, animal trials took on supernatural undertones. If rats destroyed a harvest or wolves attacked the village, a priest might be called to exorcise or curse the animals in question. Townspeople would gather, candles in hand, as the priest denounced the criminal creatures. It was part theatre, part superstition, and part community catharsis. A chance to blame misfortune on something other than bad luck, poor fences, or human error. So next time your dog chews a shoe or your cat knocks over a plant, remember, at least you don't have to defend them in court. In the Middle Ages, animal misbehavior wasn't just a nuisance, it was a legal event, a public spectacle, and a reminder that nobody, not even your favorite pig, was above the law. Dice, cards, football, even chess. Various forms of entertainment were periodically outlawed for peasants. Because nothing ruins productivity like having too much fun, let's take you to a lazy afternoon in the medieval village square. You've finished your chores for the day, or at least hidden the evidence, and for once, the sun is shining. You and your neighbors are gathered for a bit of much-needed fun. Someone has a pair of handmade dice, another has a crudely drawn chessboard, and a few daredevils are eyeing a patch of grass, plotting a rough-and-tumble match of mob football. There's laughter, shouting, maybe the whiff of a friendly wager on who'll fall face first in the mud first. But just as the excitement builds, the sound of boots echoes down the lane. It's the reeve, or maybe the bailiff, frowning like someone just burned his supper. Games are banned, he bellows. And just like that, fun time is over. Yes, medieval authorities were deeply suspicious of games. Anything that distracted the lower classes from honest work was seen as a threat to productivity, morality, and, in the worst case, the social order itself. The logic was that if peasants had time for dice and cards, they probably weren't toiling hard enough, or, worse, might start gambling away their bread money, plotting minor rebellions, or inventing new sports that involved kicking the Lord's chickens. Most rulers and clergy were united in their quest to keep fun in check, periodically issuing bans on frivolous amusements or idle gatherings. The list of forbidden games was long and creative. Dice was the number one offender, gambling was a big problem, and with coins in short supply, people would bet anything. Eggs, favors, chores, even future harvests. Lose a bet, and you might owe your neighbor a month's worth of onion peeling. Card games were also suspect, especially when homemade decks started circulating. They weren't just distractions, they were seen as possible vehicles for magic, cheating, or, at the very least, creative cursing. Football, by which we mean mob football, a chaotic, anything-goes melee involving an inflated pig bladder and two teams with no real rules, was a particular obsession for lawmakers. Matches could spill into the streets, trample crops, break windows, and cause so many bruises that half the village was limping for a week. Authorities banned it over and over, yet somehow the games kept happening, usually right after someone's ale supply was refreshed. Even chess, the game of kings, wasn't safe from periodic bans. Sometimes it was considered too noble for peasants, other times it was seen as a distraction from prayer or fieldwork. No chess on Sundays, declared one church warden, and definitely not during Lent. If you played in secret, you risked a fine or a stern sermon on the dangers of idle hands. Enforcement was inconsistent but always theatrical. The bailiff might confiscate dice and burn them in the square, or parade through the village carrying a sign that read, "No games allowed." Repeat offenders could be fined, assigned extra work, or shamed by being forced to recite prayers in public. Worst of all, your neighbors might rat you out for the promise of a reduced tithe or a chunk of the Lord's leftover cheese. Still, peasants were nothing if not resourceful. Forbidden games simply moved underground, behind barns, in the woods, or late at night by candlelight. Kids invented new games on the spot, just vague enough to dodge the bans. No, we're not gambling. We're practicing our counting. We're not playing football. We're herding the chickens, synergetically. The church and the Lord could outlaw fun, but they could never quite catch it. So next time you play a board game, kick a ball, or bet your friend $5 they can't eat a whole lemon, be grateful. In the Middle Ages, a little fun could cost you your reputation, your allowance, or your dignity. But for the medieval peasant, the joy of the forbidden game was always worth the risk, even if it meant spending Monday explaining why you had chessboard-shaped sunburn. Odd but true, there are medieval records of people fined for wearing shoes on holy days. Barefoot is next to godliness, apparently. Picture it, Sunday morning, and you're getting ready for church, tiptoeing across your hut's freezing dirt floor. Your one pair of shoes, if you're lucky enough to own any at all, sits by the door, battered but still better than nothing. But wait, it's a feast day, a day of rest, a day of worship. The local rules, and the ever-watchful eye of the parish beadle, dictate that you leave your shoes at home. That's right. For at least a few holy days a year, it's all about cold toes and public displays of humility. The reasoning was part tradition, part theology, and part social control. Walking barefoot on Sundays and certain festivals was supposed to be an act of piety, an imitation of the saints, a gesture of humility before God, and a reminder that in the grand scheme of things, a little suffering might just save your soul. After all, if Jesus walked the dusty roads of Galilee barefoot, who were you to strut into church with your barely functional leather boots? But like all things medieval, the rules weren't just about religion, they were also about enforcing social equality, at least for a few hours. The wealthiest villager and the poorest shepherd stood side by side, toes equally numb, mud equally squishing between their feet. No one could flash their fancy footwear or show off a new pair of pointed poulaines. For a moment, the class divide was, very briefly, levelled at the threshold of the church door. Of course, the practical reality was more complicated. Not everyone relished the idea of freezing feet, especially in the depths of a medieval winter. Children were especially vulnerable to chilblains, frostbite, and a general sense of misery. Grandmothers complained. Parents negotiated. Some tried to sneak in with woolen foot wraps, hoping the beadle wouldn't notice. Others arrived barefoot and promptly put their shoes back on the minute the priest's back was turned. Where there's a will and a risk of frostbite, there's a workaround. Enforcement was inconsistent but memorable. The beadle or parish constable would station themselves at the church door, casting a suspicious eye at every ankle. If you were caught in shoes, you might be fined, sent home, or, most humiliatingly, ordered to remove your footwear and walk a lap around the church for all to see. Repeat offenders could end up in the stocks or subject to a stern talking to from the priest about the importance of humility and obedience. Shoes themselves became symbols of status. Owning a second pair was a luxury. Having a pair for best, reserved for feast days, ironically when you weren't allowed to wear them, was unheard of among peasants. For the wealthy, not being allowed to display their fine boots was a particular kind of penance. There are tales of lords grumbling as much as their tenants, quietly ruining the local law while tiptoeing barefoot through the icy nave. For some, barefoot Sundays became a badge of honor. Elders would reminisce about the good old days when everyone walked to church barefoot through snow, uphill both ways. Children, meanwhile, invented games to see who could hop across the coldest patches fastest. And competitive parents boasted about whose kid had the toughest feet. It was misery, but it was communal misery. And sometimes, that made all the difference. Still, most people were happy to put their shoes back on as soon as they could. Markets and festivals right after church saw a sudden, miraculous proliferation of footwear. Bare feet were holy. Shod feet meant business, and, if you were lucky, warmth. So next time you slip on your sneakers for a Sunday stroll, spare a thought for your medieval ancestors and their cold, muddy, pious toes. In a world obsessed with rules about who could wear what and when, sometimes the greatest act of devotion was just surviving a sermon without losing a toe to frostbite. Now that's what I call soul-searching. If a cow wanders into your yard and you don't immediately announce it to the whole village, you're on the hook for a fine, even if you just wanted to pet it. Let's paint the scene. It's a lazy afternoon, and you're sweeping your doorstep when a shaggy, mud-spattered cow saunters into your garden like it owns the place. Maybe you smile. Maybe you give it a scratch behind the ear. After all, in a world of endless toil and turnip soup, a surprise cow visit is about as exciting as life gets. But beware. In the eyes of medieval law, livestock is never just lost or visiting. It's property. It's profit. And if you don't immediately raise the alarm, it's also your problem. Medieval villages ran on strict lost and found codes, especially when it came to valuable creatures like cows, sheep, pigs, or the occasional goat with a taste for adventure. Everyone knew whose animals were whose, more or less. But fences were more like suggestions than barriers, and the daily parade of wandering livestock was just part of the rural soundtrack. The problem was, any animal unclaimed for too long could be considered detained, and the detainer, that's you, innocent cow petter, could be fined, shamed, or, in the worst-case scenario, accused of plotting to appropriate someone else's future beef stew. So, what was a well-meaning peasant to do? The rules were clear. The moment an unfamiliar animal turned up on your patch, you had to announce it to the entire community. That meant grabbing the village crier, ringing a bell, or, if you were really hoping for dramatic effect, marching through the streets shouting, "Whose cow is this?" at the top of your lungs. Think of it as the medieval version of posting in the Lost and Found group chat, only with more shouting and slightly fewer emojis. Of course, this system worked about as well as you'd expect. Sometimes, the rightful owner would materialize immediately, ready to scold their wayward beast and thank you with a loaf of bread or a suspiciously small coin. Other times, there would be confusion, finger-pointing, and the inevitable argument about whether it was definitely Martha's brown cow or probably Tom's because it looks shifty. Meanwhile, the cow itself would stand there chewing cud, blissfully unconcerned by the legal drama unfolding around it. If the animal went unclaimed for a certain period, anywhere from a day to several weeks, depending on local custom, it could be confiscated by the village authorities, auctioned off, or, in rare cases, allowed to stay with its new host. But not before the proper paperwork was filed, witnesses consulted, and, if the beast was valuable enough, the whole business recounted in the manorial court for years to come. Penalties for failing to follow lost and found protocol could be steep. The fines were meant to discourage opportunistic adoption of valuable livestock. Caught keeping quiet? Prepare to fork over a hefty sum, do some community labor. Or, for the truly unlucky, be paraded through the village square with a sign announcing your new title, Cow Napper. Even children weren't immune. There are stories of kids being scolded for accidentally hiding a neighbor's duck for a day of free eggs. Naturally, villagers found ways to game the system. Some would give the cow a hasty new haircut or a mud bath to obscure its markings, hoping no one noticed. Others would make a very half-hearted announcement, a mumble at the well, a whispered inquiry at the tavern. But with so many eyes and ears, and nosy neighbours, in the village, the truth usually came out. The gossip alone was a deterrent. Nobody wanted to be the talk of the town for all the wrong reasons. So next time you find a stray dog, a wandering chicken, or even just a suspiciously friendly squirrel, spare a thought for your medieval ancestors. In their world, lost and found wasn't just a matter of kindness. It was a legal minefield, a social event, and, occasionally, a public humiliation. And always remember, pet the cow at your own risk. Selling cheese. Prepare for the cheese wardens, who literally weighed your product and inspected it for, wait for it, illicit holes, too many, and you're suspected of skimming off cream for yourself. Let's step into the bustling medieval marketplace, where the smell of livestock mingles with the scent of fresh bread and cheese. You've woken up early, churned, pressed, and worried over your dairy all week. Now it's time to sell your prized wheels at market. You're proud, until you spot the unmistakable approach of the cheese wardens. These were not kindly grandmothers or cheese enthusiasts. These were stern officials whose entire job was to make sure nobody in the village was cheating on their cheddar. The logic was simple. Cheese was valuable, essential food, and like everything else in the Middle Ages, its sale was wrapped in layers of regulation. It wasn't enough to simply show up and sell your dairy. Your cheese had to meet exacting standards, size, weight, even the number and distribution of holes. Too many, and the wardens would raise an eyebrow, and their quills, in suspicion. In their eyes, a hole wasn't just a hole, it was a sign you'd skimmed off cream for your own use, leaving your neighbours with a wheel of low-fat disappointment. The inspection was a public event. Cheese wardens arrived with scales and special poking sticks, ready to prod, and then prod some more. They'd weigh each wheel and slice, examining textures, sniffing for hidden sourness, and, most famously, checking for holes. If they suspected your cheese was lighter than it should be, or had been tampered with, you could be fined, shamed, or have your whole stall shut down. Some markets even posted a list of cheese offenders, a sort of dairy blacklist that could ruin your reputation for seasons to come. For the average peasant, the rules were both a nuisance and a minor terror. Cheese was a vital food, especially in winter, and anything that threatened your ability to sell it meant real hardship. And let's be honest, medieval cows weren't exactly reliable. A rainy summer, a sick calf, or a few lazy goats could spell disaster for your cheese output. If you tried to stretch your product a little, maybe adding some water, a pinch of flour, or yes, keeping a bit of the cream for yourself, you did it with the knowledge that the cheese wardens might catch you. It was a game of cat and mouse, or perhaps cheese and warden. Of course, the cheese wardens themselves were not immune to temptation. Tales circulated about wardens who could be bribed with a particularly fine wedge, or who would overlook a questionable batch in exchange for a favour at the next village feast. Others took their duties so seriously that they became legends in their own right, inspiring both fear and a grudging respect. The sternest among them could spot a skimmed cheese from across the square, and their annual hole count was the stuff of local gossip. And the scrutiny didn't stop at cheese. Butter, milk, even eggs were sometimes inspected, often with equally arcane rules and penalties. There are stories of villagers getting into heated debates with officials over the correct colour of yolks, or whether a batch of butter was too creamy, to be honest. Dairy drama, medieval style. As with most rules, peasants found creative ways to cope. Some carefully crafted show cheese for inspection, keeping the real, richer wheels tucked away for trusted customers. Others found ways to patch or disguise holes with soft cheese, or to weight their wheels with a little extra whey. Still, the system mostly worked, not because it was flawless, but because everyone was in it together, trying to keep the peace, the cheese, and the cheese wardens happy. So next time you grumble at the deli counter or inspect your brie for the perfect amount of holes, spare a thought for your medieval ancestors. For them, selling cheese wasn't just business. It was a balancing act, a gamble, and a regular dance with the stern men and women who weighed your dairy and judged your honesty, one illicit hole at a time. Think you can hide at home during a mandated festival? Sorry, there's a fine for that. Everyone must show up, dance, and pretend to enjoy stale pottage for the honor of the local saint. Imagine, it's the feast of St. Blandina, patron of lost sheep and mediocre turnip crops. The church bells ring out. The air smells faintly of overcooked cabbage, and the whole village is bustling with awkward enthusiasm. You'd rather stay home, nurse your sore feet, and quietly hope the rain holds off. But skipping a festival isn't just antisocial, it's illegal. In the Middle Ages, mandated merriment was serious business. And the only thing worse than missing out on a free cup of ale was getting caught doing so. The logic was, as always, a blend of faith, community, and control. Festivals honored saints, marked the seasons, and kept everyone connected. If too many people skipped out, the event would flop, the local priest would sulk, and the Lord might wonder if the village spirit needed a good fining. To make sure this never happened, laws required attendance. The parish priest, never one to miss a party or an opportunity for a head count, kept a careful eye on who was dancing, singing, or at least shuffling along with the crowd. Attendance wasn't just about showing up. It was about being seen participating. Dancing was encouraged, singing along was practically mandatory, and anyone who looked bored risked a well-aimed cabbage from the more festive crowd. If you slipped away early, you'd find yourself the subject of gossip. If you didn't show up at all, you could be fined, scolded, or given an extra fun job at the next festival. Think mucking out the animal pens while everyone else feasted. The fines for non-attendance varied. Sometimes it was a coin or two, sometimes a portion of your next harvest, or even a loaf of bread delivered to the priest's house. Bonus points if it was still warm. Repeat offenders might find themselves conscripted as the festival fool or forced to recite poetry before an unforgiving audience of chickens and small children. And in some villages, the penalty for skipping out was public shame. A seat in the stocks, a dunce cap, or a banner that read, "Too good for St. Blandina's dance." For peasants, festivals were both blessing and burden. Sure, there was a break from relentless labor, a chance to see friends, share gossip, and eat something vaguely different than usual. But the pressure to participate was real. You couldn't just hover at the edge. You needed to be visibly, enthusiastically involved. Even children were counted, with mothers herding them like sheep into the square to avoid the dreaded absent family fine. And not all festivals were created equal. Some were lively affairs with music, games, and barrels of ale that somehow never ran dry. Others were drearier, more fasting than feasting, with solemn processions, endless prayers, and food that tasted like someone had confused the saint's day with Lent. Woe to anyone caught yawning during the 7th recitation of the village's official hymn. Naturally, villagers found clever workarounds. Some sent lookalikes, cousins or neighbors with similar builds and hats, to stand in for them. Others bribed the festival organizers for a pass, or hid in the back, only emerging for the group dance or the all-important bread blessing. The truly bold would claim illness, though this meant a home visit from the priest, armed with holy water and questions. Despite the hassle, festivals were often the highlight of the year, a rare pause in the grind of medieval life. Even those who complained the loudest were usually spotted laughing, singing, or, after a few ales, inventing new dances for next year's festival. And when the fines were paid, the banners packed away, and the pottage pots finally scrubbed clean, life would settle back into its usual rhythm, until the next saint decided it was time to party. So, the next time you're invited to a mandatory work party or a family reunion, remember, it could be worse. At least nobody's threatening you with a fine or a stint as the designated cabbage juggler. In medieval times, celebration wasn't just encouraged, it was enforced, whether you wanted it or not. Need a bucket of water? If you draw from the wrong stream, you might be in for a legal battle. Streams, wells, and even puddles were sometimes property of the local lord, and taking from them was a criminal act. Let's picture a classic medieval morning. The sun is barely up, your tongue feels like you've been eating straw all night, and your only hope for something remotely drinkable is the small stream winding through the edge of the village. You grab your bucket, trudge out into the mist, and just as you lower it into the water, someone shouts your name. It's the Lord's steward, or maybe old Henry, the self-appointed puddle inspector. You've just committed a crime. Illegal hydration. Welcome to the wild world of medieval water rights, where even the most basic necessity was a matter of law, privilege, and a stunning capacity for pettiness. Water sources, whether sparkling streams, ancient wells, or rain-filled ditches, were claimed, regulated, and fiercely protected. The right to take water was not universal. It depended on your status, your connections, and sometimes your willingness to bribe the right person with a wheel of cheese or a favor in haymaking season. Most peasants relied on communal wells or public streams, but even these were subject to rules. Wells could be locked up after dark to prevent theft. Streams might have signs or, more often, angry grandmothers, warning off anyone from a neighboring hamlet. If the lord declared a particular spring or pond as his own, you could find yourself paying a water fee just to fill your bucket, money that always seemed to go straight to funding the lord's next boar hunt or stained glass window. And it wasn't just about drinking water. Water powered the village mill, watered crops, and, if you were lucky, washed at least a few socks now and then. Arguments over water rights could turn neighbors into lifelong enemies. "He took from my stream" was a medieval insult, second only to "your cow trampled my cabbage." Disputes sometimes ended up in manorial court, with each side presenting evidence, witnesses, and occasionally interpretive maps that looked suspiciously like a child's doodle. Judges might side with whoever brought the best bribe, or the tastiest cake. Let's not forget about the puddle wars. Yes, even stagnant rainwater had value. If your neighbor's roof funneled more runoff into your yard, congratulations, you now had to negotiate terms for using their puddle. During droughts, fights could erupt over even the smallest sources of moisture. Steal a bucket from the wrong well and risk being the main character in a village-wide scandal. And then there were the water watchers, those tireless souls appointed to enforce the rules. Their main qualifications were an unhealthy obsession with other people's business and the ability to remember who used which bucket. They'd lurk near the well, counting trips, measuring buckets, and, if you were a repeat offender, threatening to report you to the Lord. Some even took it upon themselves to patrol the stream at odd hours, just in case someone was sneaking a midnight sip. Punishments for violating water rights varied, but none of them were fun. Fines were common, but so were forced apologies, public shaming, or a day of carrying water for the village as penance. Repeat offenders could lose their own well privileges, forcing them to rely on the charity, or lack thereof, of their suddenly very smug neighbors. Occasionally, a real feud would erupt, complete with sabotage. Think plugging your rival's well with mud or rerouting the stream so it flowed a few inches away from their land. Of course, necessity is the mother of creative lawbreaking. Villagers got up before dawn to fetch water in secret, built camouflaged side buckets to take a little extra, and, when things got desperate, traded favors or stories in exchange for a dip in someone else's pond. Some went so far as to borrow water with the promise of returning it after the next rain, a logic only a parched medieval peasant could truly appreciate. So next time you fill your glass from the tap or take a long shower, spare a grateful thought for your ancestors, for whom a drink of water required cunning, luck, and the patience to survive yet another round of "Who owns the puddle this week?" In medieval Europe, water wasn't just life. It was a daily legal drama, one drop at a time. Want a pet dog? Sure, as long as it's small enough to fit through a tiny ring. Anything larger is a luxury reserved for nobles, because nothing says status like a lapdog that doubles as a foot warmer. Let's take you back to a misty medieval morning. You're trudging down the lane to the village well, your mind wandering between breakfast and the latest gossip. When suddenly, you spot the local reeve with what looks like a giant metal bracelet. "Bring out your dogs," he calls. And a cluster of villagers gathers, each clutching a nervous, squirming mutt. The ritual is familiar. Each animal must pass through the dog gauge, a ring just big enough for a small terrier, but definitely not your uncle's lumbering sheepdog. If your furry friend can squeeze through, you're in the clear. If not, well, prepare for paperwork, a fine and possibly an invitation to the Lord's kennel. Not as fun as it sounds. The logic behind the dog laws was classic medieval thinking. Every animal, even your beloved pet, was an indicator of your social status. Large hunting dogs, impressive hounds, or anything resembling a wolf in disguise were the sole privilege of the gentry and noble classes. The reasoning? Big dogs were expensive to feed, even more expensive to train, and, in the eyes of the upper crust, far too magnificent for the likes of ordinary villagers. Peasants were meant to own dogs for one thing only: chasing rats, guarding scraps, or keeping your feet marginally warmer on cold nights. Anything more was seen as getting above your station. Enforcement of dog size was an annual affair in many places. On Dog Day, all villagers had to present their pups for the ring test. There were always a few suspenseful moments as people tried to stuff suspiciously well-fed animals through the hoop, while others prayed that last year's runt hadn't packed on too many winter pounds. For the truly desperate, there were techniques, hours of training to slouch, duck, or tuck, not to mention bribing the local kids to distract the reeve while you made your getaway. It was, in a sense, the world's earliest dog show, if the prize for best in breed was not getting confiscated. Fail the test, and your options were limited. You could petition the local lord for a special license, but that usually involved a bribe, a favor, or some distant family connection to the castle cook. Most often, the unlucky dog was either sent to live with the lord's pack or encouraged to wander off and find a less fussy village. Heartbreaking for families who'd raised a dog from puppyhood, but in medieval Europe, sentimentality always took a back seat to the social order. The obsession with dog size had practical roots too. The nobility didn't want peasants sneaking into royal forests with large hunting dogs and poaching game reserved for the elite. A scruffy little terrier wasn't much threat to the king's deer, but a muscular mastiff absolutely was. These laws were enforced not just to flaunt privilege but to protect hunting rights and, let's be honest, the lord's ego. Of course, villagers weren't above creative solutions. Some kept their forbidden dogs hidden away, only letting them out at night. Others disguised their animals as giant rats or very odd pigs when the inspector came calling. There are records of peasants dyeing a dog's coat, shaving it down, or even wrapping it in a cloth to shrink its appearance. Where there's a will and a loyal mutt, there's a way. Over time, some lords got tired of playing dog catcher and quietly let the rules slide, at least as long as nobody was caught poaching and no large hound chased the parish priest's geese. Others doubled down, relishing the spectacle and the opportunity for a little extra coin in the form of fines. So next time you see a pampered golden retriever at the park or complain about leash laws, spare a thought for the medieval villager desperately trying to pass off a sturdy sheepdog as a lap-sized terrier, all in the name of legal canine companionship. In a world where every animal was an emblem of status, even your best friend had to fit the rules, or else risk becoming the Lord's next favorite hunting companion. The final and most persistent rule: pay, pay, and pay again. Taxes on everything from your house, your harvest, your shoes, your marriage, and sometimes just your continued existence. Miss a payment? Expect a visit from the local collector, and he's never alone. Let's set the mood. It's early spring. You're just getting over the sniffles. Thank you, medieval drafty windows, and you're tallying your meager store of coins. That's when you hear it, the unmistakable knock at the door, a rhythm known throughout the village as the tacksman's anthem. You open up, and there's the collector, flanked by two sturdy assistants, one to take notes, the other to remind you of your obligations if you get any bright ideas. He's holding a scroll, a quill, and a face that hasn't smiled since last Michaelmas. It's time to pay up, again. Taxation in the Middle Ages was not just a once-a-year annoyance. It was a way of life. There were taxes on your land, your livestock, your tools, your crops, your use of the village mill, and even your windows and doors, as you've already survived. Just when you thought you'd scraped together enough to get by, another fee would appear, sometimes as a gift to the Lord, not optional, sometimes as a special levy for the king's war, and sometimes as a cheerful surprise from the local priest who'd like to remind you about your overdue tithe. Tithes were, in theory, for the glory of God and the upkeep of the church. In practice, they felt suspiciously like yet another tax. Except this one came with the threat of damnation if you missed a payment. Every peasant owed 1/10 of everything they grew, harvested, or earned. Eggs, wool, even the few sad onions from your garden. Didn't matter if you needed every scrap to feed your family. The church ledger had no sympathy. The priest would bless you for your faith, and then quietly send someone to double-check your math. Then came the banalities. Fees for using the Lord's mill, oven, or wine press. You couldn't just bake your bread at home if the Lord had a perfectly good oven he could charge you for, same with grinding grain or pressing grapes. Every step of making food for your table came with a toll, and if you tried to skirt the system, say by baking bread in your neighbor's fireplace at midnight, you risked a fine, a public scolding, or, in extreme cases, an appearance in the manor court for illegal baking. Yes, there were people in history who went to trial for clandestine sourdough. Even milestones in your personal life were monetized. Getting married? That'll be a marriage tax, plus a little something for the priest's time. Have a baby? Baptism fee? Bury a relative? Funeral tax, grave digging fee, and maybe a coin for the bell ringer. There were hearth taxes, count your fireplaces, poll taxes, just for being alive, and the ever-popular extraordinary levies, which arrived any time the local lord had a new project, or the king had gotten himself into another war with France. If you couldn't pay, things got awkward. The collector was persistent, often returning with backup, the reeve, the bailiff, and sometimes the village constable, who always seemed to be looking for an excuse to flex his authority. They might confiscate your best tools, a portion of your harvest, or, if you were truly unlucky, your only goat. Some families ended up working off their debts with unpaid labor, fixing roads, hauling timber, or doing the collector's chores. There was no bankruptcy, only please don't take my last pair of shoes. Of course, the creative peasant tried to dodge, bargain, or delay payments. Maybe you hid your best onions, buried a stash of coins under the chicken coop, or tried to pass off your neighbor's sheep as your own, which, let's face it, probably led to more fines later. But the collectors always came back, and the tally always seemed to grow. So, next time you grumble about sales tax or wonder why you're paying a convenience fee, spare a thought for your medieval ancestors. For them, taxation wasn't just a line on a bill. It was a daily struggle, an ongoing performance, and the ultimate reminder that in the Middle Ages, there was no escape from the long, bony hand of the collector, not even for a saint. You've managed to survive another winter on black bread and the occasional questionable root vegetable, but now it's time for the yearly public health parade. Enter the parish priest or the local reeve, peering into your mouth to make sure you still have enough teeth to chew the Lord's rye. Lose too many, and you're on gruel duty. Try hiding a rotten molar, and you'll get a lecture on personal hygiene delivered by a man who bathes annually, at best. Let's imagine the scene. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth, barnyard, and medieval body odor. You're standing in a muddy queue with your fellow villagers. everyone clutching their jaws and nervously running their tongues over whatever dental assets they have left. It's the day of the tooth inspection, one of those events that nobody looks forward to except, perhaps, the local priest, who relishes the rare chance to wield authority and a rusty candle snuffer in the same hand. The process is simple. Stand still, open wide, and let the designated official take a close, sometimes very close, look at your teeth. Peasants were expected to have a minimum number of functioning molars, especially if they wanted to work the fields or, heaven help you, serve in the manor kitchen. Too few teeth meant you couldn't chew the coarser grains, the tough rye crust, or the dried peas that passed for lunch on most days. The thinking was practical. If you couldn't eat solid food, you'd slow down work, need special care, or cost the lord extra in the village gruel supply. If the inspector found a mouthful of healthy-ish teeth, you got a pass and maybe even a nod of respect. But woe to anyone with a suspicious gap or a set of suspiciously brown chompers. The penalty could be a demotion to soft food-only rations, which, in medieval terms, meant more watery gruel and less chance at the coveted crust of bread. In some villages, you'd be assigned tooth helper duty, tasked with collecting herbs for toothpaste. Spoiler, mostly mint and a lot of hope, or scrubbing the communal soup pot. The real punishment, of course, was the public embarrassment. Nothing says village gossip like being called out for bad teeth by a man who still uses a stick as a toothbrush. Let's talk hygiene. Medieval dental care was a little improvised. You might scrub your teeth with a rag, a bit of chalk, or a whittled stick. Some people chewed on fennel or sage to freshen their breath before inspection. Others just prayed the inspector had a cold and couldn't smell a thing. Toothaches were a constant plague. Painful, persistent, and usually solved by extraction with whatever tool was handy. Think pliers rather than dentist. If you were lucky, your teeth survived childhood. If not, you perfected the art of gumming your way through stew before your 25th birthday. Naturally, villagers tried to game the system. There were whispered tricks. Stuff a bit of chewed bread in the gap, smile with only your good side, or hide in the back of the line and hope the inspector got bored. Kids were drilled in tooth presentation, coached to flash a quick, non-committal grin and then duck away before questions could be asked. But the sharp-eyed priest or reeve always found a way, poking and prodding until every dental secret was revealed. Tooth inspections were also a handy excuse for broader public health lectures. After checking your molars, the inspector would waggle a finger about cleanliness, virtue, or whatever rumor was going around about the link between tooth decay and moral decay. You'd nod along, trying not to laugh at the irony, and swear to chew more mint next year. So, the next time your dentist reminds you to floss, just smile and think of your medieval ancestors, standing in a muddy line, praying for mercy, and hoping their last tooth wouldn't be the one to betray them. In those days, a gap-toothed smile wasn't just a cosmetic issue. It was a ticket to more gruel, a lot more gossip, and a lifetime of soup. You've misplaced your cap, a crime in itself, apparently. In some villages, losing your hat was more than just a bad hair day. It meant you owed the lord a small fee for being negligent with your garments. It's the only time in history when headgear was considered legal property and fashion statement all rolled into one. Misplace it twice? That's suspicious behavior, worthy of interrogation. Imagine a brisk morning in your medieval village. You're halfway out the door before you realize your head feels unusually breezy. Your hat, your only hat, hand-stitched and passed down from your great-uncle who, legend has it, wore it at the Battle of Turnip Hill, is missing. This is not just a personal crisis. It's a potential brush with the long, pointy arm of the law. In a world obsessed with order, conformity, and identifying everyone at a glance, the humble hat played a starring role. Hats were not just for keeping your ears warm or your scalp sunburn-free. They were legal markers, signifiers of your station, your job, even your marital status. The Lord's Reeve knew who should be wearing what: peasants in plain wool, artisans in caps with a small trim, the local tanner in something permanently stained. If you lost yours, the whole village could be in a tizzy. Was it stolen? Did you pawn it for ale? Or, worse, were you trying to disguise yourself as a higher or lower status to get away with some mischief? In some villages, the lost hat law was more than just an informal threat. It was written into the local bylaws, alongside fines for wandering pigs and suspiciously loud singing after curfew. If you were caught hatless on a workday, you'd be summoned to explain yourself to the manor court, usually in front of your neighbours, the bailiff, and whatever livestock happened to be passing by. The penalty might be a fine, a groat or two, a loaf of bread, or even a day's labour fixing the Lord's fence. For repeat offenders, the consequences grew steeper, as everyone knew that a person who lost their hat more than once was surely up to no good. Some lords viewed a lost hat as a sign of dangerous carelessness. If you couldn't keep track of your own cap, how could you be trusted to tend the sheep, mind the Lord's tools, or remember your place at the maypole dance? There were even stories of local courts interrogating the serial hat losers, grilling them on the whereabouts of their missing headgear with all the drama of a courtroom mystery. Where were you, good wife Martha, when your hat disappeared for the second time this month? Who can vouch for your head covering? Of course, hats themselves were precious commodities. Most peasants had only one, maybe two if they were particularly lucky or crafty. Lost hats were sometimes found days later in the strangest places, wedged in a hedge, floating down the village stream, or discovered on the head of a particularly sneaky goat. Returning a lost hat was an act of charity, but also an opportunity for gossip. Saw your cap in the pig pen, did you lose it, or were you hoping for a promotion to swineherd? Not surprisingly, hat theft was a known crime. With hats doubling as identity cards, stealing one could help you slip past the reeve or dodge a tax collector. There were tales of cunning beggars who collected hats to impersonate different villagers, causing confusion at market and endless headaches for local officials. Hat amnesty days were occasionally held, when villagers could return borrowed headgear with no questions asked. Though naturally, the best hats never came back. Medieval villagers, being practical, developed creative solutions: chin straps, hat pins, or even tying their caps to their tunics with a bit of string. Some swore by the double hat method, one for daily wear, one hidden at home, just in case of legal emergencies. Kids, meanwhile, invented games involving hat snatching, making them the #1 suspects in any disappearance. So, the next time you can't find your baseball cap or forget your beanie, be thankful there's no fine for hat negligence. In the Middle Ages, losing your headwear wasn't just embarrassing, it could be a legal and social crisis. Hats off to you for keeping track of your own. And so, as our long, law-abiding medieval day draws to a close, take a deep breath and settle in for some well-earned peace, without fear of being fined for breathing too enthusiastically. We've wandered through the labyrinth of rules that governed every waking moment of a medieval peasant's life. From the colour of your tunic to the length of your moustache, from the angle of your hat to the attitude of your goose. Survival wasn't just about hard work or luck. It was about remembering 1,000 bizarre, contradictory, and occasionally hilarious regulations dreamed up by people who definitely needed more hobbies. It's easy to laugh at the endless fines for fluffy bread, illegal candlelight, or suspiciously friendly livestock. But beneath the absurdity, there's something kind of incredible about the resilience it took just to get through a single day. Imagine living under a constant cloud of thou shalt not, and still finding reasons to celebrate, love, share a joke, and, somehow, not strangle the local ale inspector. These were people who endured not only the daily grind of dirt, hunger, and weather, but also a bureaucracy that seemed convinced happiness itself was a punishable offense. So tonight, as you tuck into your clean sheets, maybe light a totally legal candle, and drift off with zero fear that a pig inspector will barge in. Take a moment to appreciate what you have. Central heating, hot showers, all the fluffy bread and white wine you want. Nobody's counting your geese, inspecting your cheese, or interrogating your facial hair. Unless you're at a very strange family reunion, because history may be ridiculous, and sometimes even cruel. But it's also proof that humans are stubborn, hopeful, and sometimes genuinely funny in the face of nonsense. And every time you enjoy a simple comfort, you're living a little victory your ancestors fought for. One unpaid tax, one outlawed hat, and one forbidden candle at a time. Rest easy, you modern rebel. The only law here is that you get to sleep as long as you want. Good night.